Some films start with a phone call. This started in a rather old-fashioned way, with a letter. She has written 5 novels, 10 books of poetry, 2 of criticism, and 3 of short stories. There are 3 million copies of her works in print. She's published in 17 countries. She's probably Canada's best-known writer. She illustrates, she translates, she promotes, she reads publicly, and she supports causes that she believes in. Those of women and Amnesty International are closest to her. But what can you show, she said. A writer writing is a dull image. But perhaps you could come to the island where we go for holidays. My parents will be there in August, and Graham Gibson, the writer that I live with, he's the father of our 8-year-old, Jess. I was delighted. This, after all, was the setting for her novel, Surfacing, and it's where she spent a lot of her childhood, and where her father, the zoologist, worked.
We slide back through the gradual dusk. Loon voices in the distance. Bats flitter past us, dipping over the water surface, flat, calm now. The shore things, white-gray rocks and dead trees, doubling themselves in the dark mirror. Around us, the illusion of infinite space, or of no space, ourselves and the obscure shore which it seems we could touch, the water between and absence. The canoe's reflection floats with us. The paddles twin in the lake. It's like moving on air. Nothing beneath us holding us up. Suspended, we drift home.
That was from Surfacing. There is much of her in that book. The love of canoes, of wild, unspoiled places, and perhaps more. Her father taught her the plants around here, and now he teaches his granddaughter Jess and her friend.
If you eat it, Jess. This is the stuff, by the way, that Socrates drank, the Greek who was forced to commit suicide. Poison hemlock.
That's her brother Harold helping with the dishes.
I was drinking in his words and smiling away, as conceited as a cock upon a wall, when all in a breath, back went his right hand over his shoulder, like this. Something sang like an arrow through the air, because he's thrown the knife, you see. I felt a blow, and then a sharp pang, and there I was, pinned by the shoulder to the mast.
Did the nib gonna be there?
Oh, just a little bit, just right through there, and mostly through his clothes. Okay?
Like my ribbon here?
Yeah, like your ribbon. Both my pistols went off, and both escaped out of my hands. He let go of them, because he was surprised by them going off, too. They did not fall alone. With a choked cry, Israel Hands loosed his grasp upon the shrouds and plunged headfirst into the water.
How come?
He shot him by mistake.
Who did?
Jim Hawkins shot Israel Hands.
Interesting that she reads Treasure Island to Jess. I know that she loves 19th century novels.
Our captain stood on the quarter deck, and a fine little man was he. Overhaul, overhaul, let your davit tackle fall, and lower your boats to sea, brave boys. And lower your boats to sea. The boats were lowered and the men aboard, while the whales
You were telling me when you were bringing the kids up how you tried to give them all that encouragement.
Yes, I can remember the first time Peggy made applesauce. I had to leave the kitchen. I couldn't bear to see the apples being destroyed.
But you didn't tell her she was doing it the wrong way.
Oh, heavens no. Don't do that sort of thing. She'd never make it again
Right,
if you did that.
right. When Peggy was growing up, did you see any signs that she was going to do what she's done?
Well, no, I didn't, except that she started writing as soon as she could print
Yeah.
with phonetic spelling.
What sort of things did she write when she was a kid?
Oh, she wrote in grade 2, she had a book of poems called Rhyming Cats. She was really crazy about cats.
Yeah.
And she wrote a play when she was in grade, let me see, she must have been in grade 1. She was either grade 1 or grade 2. And the play, you want to hear what I thought was the best line in the whole thing?
Yes.
Well, one character says, "And if I am telling a lie, may the moon fall down on me." And the next line is, "Crash."
No explanation, just crash.
Yeah.
This is my father's section of the house. In my mother's, things are arranged on hooks and shelves in inviolable order. Cups, pots, plates, pans. This is not because my mother makes a fetish of housekeeping, but because she doesn't want to waste time on it. All her favorite recipes begin with the word quick. Less is more as far as she is concerned, and this means everything in its place. She has never been interested, luckily, in the house beautiful, but she does insist on the house convenient.
But there's surely heaven there's no nail that can't be pulled out. Not for us, sister. Not for us that time.
My father looks at this dock, his eyes narrowing in calculation, his fingers itching, and sees mainly that it needs to be repaired. The winter ice has been at it, the sun, the rain. It is patched and treacherous. Threads of rot are spreading through it. Sometime soon he will take his crowbar to it, rip apart its punky and dangerous boards and the logs excavated by nesting yellow jackets, and rebuild the whole thing new. My mother sees it as a place from which to launch canoes, and as a handy repository for soap and towel, when, about 3 in the afternoon, in the lull between the lunch dishes and reactivating the fire for supper, she goes swimming. Into the gelid, heart-stoppingly cold water she wades, over the blackened pine needles lying on the sand and the waterlogged branches, over the shells of clams and the carapaces of crayfish, splashing the tops of her arms, until she finally plunges in and speeds outward on her back, her neck coming straight up out of the water like an otter's, her head in its white bathing cap encircled by an aureole of black flies, kicking up a small weight behind her and uttering cries of refreshing, refreshing. Barometer's fallen. Bad.
Peggy, would you mind autographing these books for me?
Not at all.
It's very kind of you. Is there any pleasure in having written them all? Oh,
It was good having Merrily Wise aboard. She would relate differently to Margaret.
What did you deal with when you first started writing poetry as a woman? What were you having to deal with?
Well, I'll just change it around a little bit and say that when I first started writing poetry, it was focused very much on what would be called personal relationships, which in my case means largely relationships with men. And I think one of the difficulties for women who have come from families in which the men are not exactly lacking in confidence, such as mine, is the realization that some men are frightened. You know, that some men are very vulnerable and anxious about things. And you usually can't see why. You know, especially if they happen to be anxious about you. You can't see why they should be so anxious and shaky.
Yeah. Well, you didn't come, your family is not wimps. There aren't wimps in your family.
They aren't noted for self-doubt.
That was good for you.
Well, it was fine for me because it meant that nothing I did was threatening to them. They just weren't threatened. I could do really whatever I liked. I certainly wasn't forced into the role of having to play female. I never had any doubts that I was a girl. But I didn't see girls as threatening to men.
But what a shock for you when you started dating and going out and there was this...
shock.
There's this whole other world.
What did I say?
What am I supposed to say? And where did the circle game come from?
Oh, that was later. That was college. That was college. By the time I got to university, I was into reading Beckett and Sartre and wearing long black stockings. I'm sure you remember all this. And then you had to be gloomy. And I wrote very gloomy poetry at that time. And I think I felt pretty gloomy too. I think the crunch had come. No, I think by that time I was really serious about writing, and that was when I started to run into men who would say things like, "But why publish?" Or they would pay lip service to the writing, but really it would be something I was supposed to do in my spare time. And I think it was probably quite smart of me, or really it was chance and fate. It wasn't smart of me at all. I didn't get married until I was 27 the first time. I didn't meet Graham until I was already 30, which seems young to me now, but I had published 3 or 4 books. So he wasn't in for any big shock.
And does that free you to be with a man separate, but with him in a way that wasn't before?
Well, of course, it depends partly on having found a good stern paddler. Guy with a good J-stroke.
Where does power politics fit into that?
Power politics is a transitional period. It's pretty early.
Yeah.
And it's not this man. It's not this man.
No, obviously not this man.
No, I've been with this man now for, I think we counted up, and it was 12 or 13 years.
So the poems You Are Happy, those are Graham.
Those are early Graham, if we wish to put it geologically.
Pre and post Graham.
The geological stratum was early Graham, early Devonian. Barometer's rising. Spare.
But as we talked and I reread the novels on the spot, I was bothered by a certain coldness and helplessness that I found in her characters.
I'm hunting for patterns. I used the word pattern hunter, in fact, in a review that you wrote about Rider Haggard. It's a phrase I liked. And there are some patterns that are emerging in my mind. Well,
By patterns, you mean recurring motifs that add up to something of significance?
A view of life.
A view of life, all right.
Yeah, the way you see life, and I'm even going so far as to say why you see it that way.
Well, I showed Merrily an article that said that, in fact, I have no view of life. So if you believe him, you're going to have to stop right here.
I don't believe him. I think you have a very strong view of life, because I see a lot of victims in your books. What I think is victims, and I can tell you why.
If I hadn't written that book of criticism, nobody ever would have seen any of those things.
I reckon I would have.
Well, maybe.
there's a sense of people who are like puppets, that there are others pulling the strings, or let's say society is pulling the strings.
Which novel are you thinking of in
All
particular?
of them, pretty much.
Well, you see, I don't happen to agree with you about that. You can't really talk about characters and their real situations for me without talking also about what sex they happen to be.
Right.
Now, most of my characters are female characters. And in fact, for female characters in our society, glorious though that society may be in so many respects,
I detect a hint of irony.
choices are more limited. People don't usually mind it that the women kind of drift around because that's what they expect women to do.
Right.
They expect men to put on their Superman suits and go and jump off buildings and, you know, be heroic.
I see a certain growing strength in women, and you are, for many, a good example of that. And I wonder how long it's going to take until that's something you will deal with in your writing.
Okay. That's the George Eliot question for me, which is, how come George Eliot, who was a successful female writer, never wrote about a successful female writer?
Except it's not, because in your criticism of or in your discussion of black women writers, you say that when something has happened for a while, and you said it before, that when the nuclear movement has happened for a while, or when something's happened for a while, then you deal with it.
Yeah, maybe I'll deal with it.
Okay, what about women in the nuclear movement?
Yeah, sure, I could write it and it would be believable and so on. But it's not... I think those are interesting questions, but they're not, in this country, they're not life and death questions in an immediate sense. I mean, I happen to believe that they are life and death questions. You know, sure, we're all going to be blown up. That's true. But in a way, that's such a huge event that, as many people have said, it's very hard to get your mind around it in any everyday way. In fact, I have written a short story about it. It's coming out this fall.
Oh, yeah?
But I think that's one reason that people are so drawn to places like Latin America, because it seems so simple. It seems so simple and dramatic, and that you could, quotes, write a story about it that wouldn't have, quotes, a lot of interiorization in it, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't happen to be our war. You know, it doesn't happen to be a Canadian war. You could not, as a Canadian, write about that situation except as an observer.
So you don't think there is a Canadian tendency not to get passionately involved in those things? I mean,
No,
irrespective of the rights...
I don't think it's that. Canada is not historically in that kind of situation. You know, many consider that lucky. I do. Why wish upon yourself a terrible civil war that kills off thousands of people?
In order to find your identity.
In order to give you a good story as a writer. I mean, that would be totally selfish and disgusting as well.
It also bothered me that, as far as I could see, the parent figures in her novels got especially bleak treatment.
And are you drawing?
What am I doing? Well, I've chosen something incredibly difficult to do because I'm doing you.
Oh, how wonderful.
But I can't see you see.
Well, that's very symbolic, isn't it?
So,
But a writer's inspiration comes from somewhere. And it really puzzles me that...
I mean, that quality that you're finding about the families not getting on together isn't in the poetry, for instance.
yes.
Is
But,
it?
but nor are families in the poetry
Right.
that much.
They're not.
No.
Who was it who said that all happy families are the same, but each unhappy family is unhappy in a different way? I don't believe that all happy families are the same, but if you're writing a novel And that's a different thing from writing autobiography.
Right. No, I understand that.
And if you're writing a novel with a central character who has to, for instance, confront society,
Right.
or be in an isolated situation, act separately, act as a single person.
Right.
If you gave such a character a happy, supportive family, you can see, well, Tom Jones, for instance. If Tom Jones had known who his father was all along, you wouldn't have had a story,
Yeah.
would you?
No.
If Pip hadn't been an orphan, you wouldn't have had a story.
She too was bothered by my rather narrow view of her work. This came out in some filming that they did one evening when I wasn't there.
There. Who is this woman?
That's the topic.
Well, that woman is my daughter, and she's incognito.
Harold.
Okay.
Harold, would you come over?
One last
Okay.
thing.
And who is this woman?
You've got me.
Who is this woman, Evan?
My aunt.
This woman is the head of the Ku Klux Klan, masquerading as Margaret Atwood.
Okay, Michael Rubo's whole problem is that he thinks of me as mysterious and a problem to be solved, right? And for that reason, he spent a lot of the time so far trying to get the clue, trying to solve this problem. This afternoon, he was off on attack that somehow my family had been repressively benevolent. And I mean, he's trying to find out why some of my work is somber in tone, shall we say, and he's trying for some simple explanation of that in me or in my life rather than in the society that I'm portraying.
Anyway, have a wonderful rest for the rest of your vacation. And we'll see you possibly, I hope.
Are you getting into the boat right now?
Well, I'm waiting for Harold. Is that
you're
on?
going with them. I think something that shocked me when I was younger was going out into the world and realizing that very few parents were as benevolent towards their children as mine were, and it still does shock me to hear these stories of what parents have done to their children, or bizarre behavior of parents, or parents attempting to mold their children, or disinheriting their children, or being mean to their children, or being hypercritical of their children. I don't really know why they do it. So that's much more the right reason why I put those kinds of figures into my books. It's not because my own parents are like that. It's because my own parents aren't like that. In fact, I met someone recently who says that her parents never touched her at all. She can't ever remember having been touched by her parents when she was growing up. They didn't have fights. They didn't touch each other either, to her knowledge. They must have at some point because she was there. But it was just this kind of plexiglass container that everybody was supposed to walk around in. He wants to see artists as people who are complex and haunted, by something or other, and he wants to find out what I'm haunted by. And I think he's come to the conclusion that it's probably not my family.
Are you haunted?
Well,
I mean, is that, if you were to...
What is haunted? What is haunted? I think he wants to know what drives me on, what makes me do the work. The easy answer to that is that I write because I'm a writer. However, here's a clue for Michael. The influences on my novel writing were very much 19th century English, and my idea of what the novel was doing came more from people like Dickens than from people like Samuel Beckett, for instance. I do see the novel as an interaction with the society.
But do you think of yourself, if you'd have to choose between haunted and unhaunted, do you think of yourself as haunted?
Sometimes, on some days, I sit and I look at what I'm writing and I think, how can I be writing this? You know, this is dreadful, it's appalling, I don't mean bad stylistically, but it's horrifying. And sure, I have the same questions that Michael has. Where does it come from? Well, for me, it comes from what I'm looking at. The point is, I suppose, why I'm looking at that, but these days, I don't see how you can avoid it.
Well, I mean, I think there's a problem with words like demons and haunting, because it's in the tradition of the artist as an absolutely tortured soul, you know? And a lot of writers have exploited that. It's the kind of the stock in trade, and the Lowrys and the Dylan Thomases, and you know, instead of asking about demons and hauntings, you know, maybe ask about the muse, you know, which is a much more classical thing.
So I asked her if she had a muse.
So if you asked yourself the same question.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And?
Yes, I would say I did have one, but only for poetry.
And is it male or female?
It's female.
It's female?
Mm.
And does it have a shape or form? Or?
Old.
It's an old?
Old.
An old woman?
Mm.
Ah.
Mm.
How did you meet, and was it instant attraction?
No. We met at a party for Milton Acorn in 1971, I think. No, could it have been 1970?
An alternative Governor General's Award, because he hadn't won it. And so it was, someone dubbed it the People's Governor General's Award for the People's Poet.
Ah.
So we were both there, and we had both not won the Governor General's Award that year, which was for 1969, and I had thought that Graham's book, Five Legs, was very good, and said that I thought that possibly he ought to have won it.
Which was absolutely compelling to me, of course, because
Yes.
here she arrives at
No
this
flattery intended. It was just the kind of remark one makes.
this noisy party at Grossman's in Toronto, and she told me she thought that my book should have won the Governor General's Award, when hers was one of the three.
And conversely, you said...
So
no, he didn't.
No.
I said, my goodness, I had forgotten. I said, I was overcome, Peggy, as I so frequently am.
He melted into the crowd, and I melted out of the party.
That's right.
I'd got to like her, but not to know her. For me, she's an island on which no boats land. They circle, they peer at her, but no boats land. That's how I've seen her, through binoculars.
Mowat has sold more books than any other writer living in Canada. Since his first work was published in 1952, people around the world have bought more than 10 million copies of his books.
I have 3. Okay.
For many, he will be the only Canadian writer they will ever read.
Not writing any books at the moment. Taking a sort of sabbatical.
Oh, I see.
We're going to make some films instead.
Oh.
Soft porn.
Oh, just soft.
Unlike most Canadian literature, Mowat's books are not novels, not fiction in the accepted sense. Rather, they are factual stories told and embellished from a personal point of view. Subjective nonfiction. There have been 25 books so far, published in more than 50 countries, in 23 different languages. Mowat has told us how he feels about whales and wolves and dogs and war. He's written of Europe, of Newfoundland, of Siberia, and of course, the Arctic. His first book, People of the Deer, brought the world face to face with the realities of Arctic life. We'd forgotten that here there was a daily fight for survival. We'd forgotten that here a desperate people sometimes lost that fight and died of cold and starvation. Farley Mowat's book reminded us of that reality.
The great wind from off the congealed white desert of the Arctic Sea came seeking south across 500 miles of tundra plains. The driven snow scoured the darkness like a blast of sand until no living thing could face it. Nothing ran, nor crawled, nor flew over the broken ridges, the frozen muskegs, and the faceless, hidden lakes. Yet there was life unseen beneath the wind. On the shores of a narrow bay in North Hennick Lake, 2 snow houses crouched against the implacable violence of the gale, and within their dark confines, people listened to the wind's voice. It sank into the mind like needles into naked flesh. In the smaller of the 2 houses, there were 4 people. One of these, the year-old boy Igiaka, lay rigidly inert and did not hear the wind. His small body was shrunken into a macabre travesty of human form by the long hunger which, 2 days earlier, had given him over to the frost to kill.
Farley McGill Mowat was born in Belleville, Ontario in 1921. His mother, Helen.
I didn't realize that he felt being small very deeply. I never really thought of it, you know, I didn't. But he said, he told me one day that he said, I always felt that I was no good at sports because I was too small to be in anything. So I think that's why he turned to going off on these nature hunts so much. I never realized it because it didn't bother me, you know, I never thought of it. He was Farley, he was my child, and I never thought of him, never cared whether he was tall.
I was an outcast, partly because I was very small and couldn't play games and therefore wouldn't play games. Always looked much younger than I was, therefore was exiled from the usual peer group activity of girl chasing and whatever. Almost, but not totally exiled. Also, the way I'd lived. I had been moved around by my parents from pillar to post. We were one of the early migrants who are now the majority in our society, people who never stay anywhere long enough to know who they are in terms of where they are. I had been moved from, 6 different towns and cities, or 7, by the time I was 14. And this set me outside the pale.
Being outside the pale was a family tradition. His father, Angus, was a rugged individualist who saw himself as a man of the land, an outdoorsman, a sailor, an adventurer. He was, in fact, a small-town librarian. But his influence on Farley would be deep and lasting.
He is a dreamer who is sustained by dreams, and by one special dream. In childhood by the placid waters of the Bay of Quinte. In ignorant youth during the black night of the First World War. In early manhood enduring the drought-driven dust of the parched prairies. Always, always he has nurtured this dream, been nurtured by it. A dream of the sounding sea, the dream of a ship upon the sounding sea. The dream is on him still, unsullied, and it will remain while he remains. Wind, sails, the ship, the sea. This is my father.
In 1933, Angus took his wife and the 12-year-old Farley to live on the drought-ridden prairies. He had been appointed head librarian in Saskatoon. Farley always claimed that they moved because his father was intrigued by the combination of the words Saskatoon and Saskatchewan. Farley settled into a prairie boyhood and started writing a nature column for the local newspaper.
The reason that I clung to writing and developed it was because I could do it better than the other kids. They could do everything else better than I could, but I could write better than they could. And I could get some plaudits from my teachers. I didn't get many plaudits than the other kids. Yes, I did, by God. I used to write dirty poetry. I'd forgotten about that. Things come to me out of the subconscious. I used to write nasty little dirty limericks. And when all the other kids were talking about their hockey scores and so on, I'd say, hey guys, have you heard this one? And I'd give them my dirty limerick. And for a moment, just for a moment, it was always transitory, I would be the cynosure of all eyes. And then they'd turn back to hockey scores.
There was one friend he could rely on. Mutt and Farley would grow up together through the 11 years of Mutt's life.
I remember the time that he was killed, and Farley brought him in, and, you know, I can remember white as a ghost, Farley was. And brought him in, carried him in, and he just was so upset. You know, he seemed to like his animals just, well, better than human beings almost. You know the way he is, about his dogs.
There was no other wanderer on that road, yet I was not alone, for his tracks went with me, each paw print as familiar as the print of my own hand. My boots were sucking in the mud when a truck came howling along toward me and passed in a shower of muddy water. I glanced angrily after it, but the driver had almost hit me in his blind rush. As I watched, it swerved sharply to make the bend in the road and vanished from my view. I heard the sudden shrilling of brakes, then the roar of an accelerating motor, and it was gone. I did not know that in its passing, it had made an end to the best years that I had lived. The tracks that I had followed ended here, nor would they ever lead my heart again. The pact of timelessness between the two of us was ended, and I went from him into the darkening tunnel of the years.
Farley was 18 years old when the Second World War broke out. He joined up and went off to Europe. The war would change his life, but his skill with words would help him live through it.
I had a tremendous impulse to write, but it was a peculiar impulse. It wasn't that I wanted to record anything. It was that I wanted to escape from the effects of war. I wanted to escape from the reality of it. And everybody had their mode of doing this. Some drank a lot. Some took outrageous chances and paralyzed their sensibilities. I retreated into a never-never world, which I was able to create out of my imagination on the written page. I had a little portable typewriter that I had liberated in Sicily, and I sat down with this little portable typewriter and went back to my boyhood deliberately. And out of the writing, the scratchings, the tormented scratchings of those days, came the genesis of The Dog Who Wouldn't Be. I went back to my dog in the last analysis for comfort in a time of horror.
There was about him, from the first day he came to us, an aura of resolution and restraint and dignity. He took life seriously and expected us to do likewise. I suspect that at some early moment of his existence, he concluded there was no future in being a dog. And so, with the tenacity which marked his every act, he set himself to become something else. Subconsciously, he no longer believed that he was a dog at all, yet he did not feel that he was human. He was tolerant of both species, but he claimed kin to neither. Wherever he went, he left deep-etched memories that were alternately vivid with the screaming hues of outrage, or cloudy with the muddy colors of near dementia. He carried with him the aura of a Don Quixote, and it was in that atmosphere that my family and I lived for more than a decade.
I think the essential effect of the war upon me, apart from the usual horrific effects of death and destruction upon an individual, was to make me extremely dubious about the validity of my own species. It was really the first time that I began to understand that we aren't what we have contrived ourselves to be. The perfection of animate creation, that we are an extraordinarily and deeply flawed species. It gave me a sense of revulsion against my own species, which it did to many, many, many surviving veterans of many, many wars. That wore off after a while, but the basic conviction remained and has strengthened since, that we are a deeply flawed species, that we are perhaps hanging on to have our minute handhold on survival with palsied fingers, and that only the greatest of good luck and some kind of a miracle will enable us to hang on for much longer.
When the war was over, Captain Farley Mowat came back to Canada and headed north. He needed peace and quiet and a chance to find himself again. What he found instead was the cause that would lead to his first book. He found a tribe of Inuit people starving in the Barren Lands. Writing his book was Mowat's way of fighting for them.
I fought for their physical survival, and in the process I used any weapon I could find. And one of the weapons that was at hand was to tout them as potentially useful in the exploitation of the North. And I did that. And in that I was totally and absolutely wrong, because I may have helped to save their bodies, but I also helped to destroy their essence, to destroy them as a people. And of course I regret that. That may be the price one pays for trying to assist people who are not your own. It's a very sad sort of thing, but that's the way it is.
The book was a hit. Mowat had arrived. For the next 7 years, there would be a book every year. He would write about the North, the war, and his childhood. But by 1959, his father's fascination with the sea began to rub off on Farley. He started to research the deep-sea salvage business for what would later become 2 books, Grey Seas Under and The Serpent's Coil.
It turned out that most of the men who manned these salvage tugs were Newfoundlanders. They were the only people in the world at that time, the only people in the North American world, who could have done what was done by brute strength and by cunning and by sensitivity and understanding of the sea. And I was fascinated by them. I'd never met anybody like them. So after I'd finished the research on the first book, on Grey Seas Under, I decided to go to Newfoundland and find out for myself.
He bought a tiny Newfoundland schooner and set out to discover a new way of life. It was inevitable that Farley would want to stay in Newfoundland. He had spent a long time looking for somewhere he felt he belonged. He finally settled in the tiny outport of Burgeo. He continued writing steadily and brought out a book a year. With each book, he exposed a new chapter in his life, a new cause, a new look at the world around him. Not the world of the city and the new society, but the romantic, primitive world, where men sailed and hunted and fished and touched nature. In Burgeo, it appeared he had finally found a home. He liked the people, and for the most part, they liked him. But it was all to end. An 80-ton fin whale chasing a shoal of herring had become trapped in the pond near Mowat's house. Some of the young men of the outport started using the trapped whale for target practice. Farley tried to stop them by appealing to the media. It became an event.
What happened there essentially was that a small group of people, of Burgeo people, mostly young men, who had left the old ways, had gone up to the Great Lakes and worked for 6 months of the year on the lake boats and had made a lot of money in so doing, and who came back and had nothing to do all winter except flaunt their new gotten wealth and flaunt their new attitudes, chose to torment to death this captured whale. And it enraged me beyond any powers to describe it. I tried to describe my rage in the book. I can't do it here. But I wasn't enraged at the Newfoundlanders, and I wasn't enraged at the people that I had come to love and to know and to be associated with in the village. I was enraged at these people who were of my culture, who represented all, who had been contaminated, and contaminated with a disease which represents all that is evil to me in our culture. And there they were, masking themselves as Newfoundlanders. And they weren't Newfoundlanders, they were me, they were us. They were Torontonians, New Yorkers, Bostonians, whatever. They were people of the new culture. And there they were, spewing their bloody poison literally into the body of this animal, this gigantic animal. And I saw red. I just went insane.
Poisoned by the bullet wounds which had become infected, the whale died an agonizing death. The people of Burgeo were disgraced in the eyes of the world. As far as they were concerned, none of the publicity would have happened if Farley had kept his mouth shut. Burgeo closed ranks. Farley would have to leave.
I sat for a long time on the crest of the head, locked in the confines of my mind, savoring the bitter taste of my defeat. Then slowly I became conscious of the eternal sounding of the seas, and my thoughts drifted away from myself and the world of men, turning outward to the void of ocean, the world of whales. For the first time since the trapped whale vanished, I became fully aware of a rending sense of loss. It was dark, and there was none to know that I was weeping. Weeping not just for the whale that died, but because the fragile link between her race and mine was severed. I wept because I knew that this fleeting opportunity to bridge, no matter how tenuously, the ever-widening chasm that is isolating mankind from the totality of life had perished in a welter of human stupidity and ignorance, some part of which was mine. I wept not for the loneliness which would now be Claire's and mine as aliens among the people we had grown to love, but for the inexpressibly greater loneliness which man, having made himself the ultimate stranger on his own planet, has doomed himself to carry into the silence of his final hour.
Farley left Newfoundland and settled in the small Ontario town of Port Hope. He tried to get back to writing. He wrote about the whale, but after that he seemed to dry up. The storyteller had run out of stories. He tried to recapture Newfoundland by summering in the Magdalen Islands, but it wasn't home. The work stopped.
I was dubious, as every writer gets dubious quite often, about whether I could continue to do as well as I wanted to, or even do as well as I'd done in the past. That was probably due to lack of work more than anything. The less you write, the more dubious you become. When you're writing, you can usually feel that, my God, you're okay. But in the periods between books or between writing jobs, you tend to descend in a curve like that in your own self-esteem as a writer. That was a factor. Another problem was that I was living in two places, neither of which I was enamored with. And I was aware of the fact that I was growing older. Everything sort of piles up.
Another reason for not writing was that Farley's relationship with his father had become increasingly stormy. Angus had always exerted a strong influence on Farley's writing, whether he knew it or not.
Part of the business of being a man of causes and writing subjective nonfiction may have been my fear that if I tried to write purely literary works, I would have failed. I was under tremendous compulsion from my father and from my peers, I guess, in those days, to write literary works. It was assumed then that the only way you could be a literary figure was to write novels, plays, or poetry. Anything else was ultra-dig. It was pure commercialism. It was not relevant to the literary scene. And partly because my father pressed me heavily, although indirectly, to try and be a literary figure, I guess I revolted against that subconsciously and chose another route. The other route was open to me, though. There it was. Nobody was using it. It was an open channel. And it was to write subjective nonfiction that were cause-motivated.
Whether it was coincidence or whether there was a deep-rooted reason, Farley only started serious writing again after his father died in 1977. The book that would be born through his father's death was written here in Cape Breton. Farley found a house and 200 acres of land by the sea. He began to feel at home again. He hadn't done any serious work in 6 years, but here in the peace of maritime Canada, he went back to his youth and back to the war. He had already written a history of his regiment, but he now felt that he had more to say. This time he went back to his typewriter to produce what many people feel is his best book, And No Birds Sang.
A world of shadows, of primordial gloom, of inchoate violence lay around me, and no birds sang. Memory jarred convulsively. Oh, what can ail thee, night at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. A moment's respite in the time that was. Then I was staring down a vertiginous tunnel where all was dark and bloody, and the great wind of ultimate desolation howled and hungered. I was alone. Relentlessly alone in a world I never knew. I walked out of the salient like a disembodied spirit. Presumably there was shell fire, but I do not recall it. My perceptions were clouded by a mutiny within, by the withdrawal of sensation. I walked in the silence within myself, hearing nothing but an echo of the great wind.
Farley's readership is not only enormous, but devoted. Why he's so popular, no one knows. Perhaps it's because his world, unpleasant as it is in some books, can still be presented to an aunt at birthdays or a child at Christmas. Perhaps it's simply because he's a good writer.
Cocktail parties are nothing new to W.O. Mitchell. He's one of Canada's most sought-after literary figures. People all over the country flock to his public readings. And he's a regular guest on radio and television shows, even with a stiff neck.
My grandson was trying a handspring. I said, can you do a snap-up? And no, he couldn't. So I said, well, I'll show you how. I hadn't done it for 20 years. You know, you bring your knees way back over and then you explode them and throw with the back of your head. And I just threw my goddamn disc right out. So it won't happen again.
What did your grandson say?
William Ormond Mitchell was born in Weyburn, Saskatchewan in 1914. His father was the local druggist. The town has grown a lot since Mitchell was a boy, but people here still remember him.
Yeah, he's a great native of Weyburn, is W.O. Mitchell. You know W.O. Mitchell, his books and his play at Arcola. You gotta get a haircut. Go on. Well, you sure had one 3 weeks ago.
I used to be afraid of getting old when I was a kid on the prairies. Now, the reason, I think, was my father died when I was 5, so I never really ever knew my dad. I remembered him, and then I remembered remembering him, and then I remembered remembering him. Mother would take us out, and we would stand in the cemetery. Great, huge granite stone. And stand. And my father was down there. And I remember there was a gopher hole right in front of that gray rock that said, loved by all who knew him, O.S. Mitchell. Incidentally, my older son is named O.S. Mitchell. He's alive. And a gopher came out of that hole, and I remember being outraged. This would be when I'd be about 9, maybe 10. What the hell right did that gopher have digging? Because my brothers and I were very careful when we were in the cemetery and walking around. We always stepped over. We wouldn't step on the sacred bones of people under there. And here's a bloody gopher coming out of my father's grave. And then I looked up and I saw my mother crying. What I'm getting at is, I think that I discovered my own mortality around about the age of 8 or 9. Because when I looked up at my mother and the tears coming down her cheeks, I knew that death was the one irreversible step. That's all, there ain't no more. So that's pretty early age. I guess most prairie children, with the evidences of death around them when they walk over the prairie, very early learn they're mortal.
Mortality is a major theme running through almost all of Bill Mitchell's work. His first book, Who Has Seen the Wind, was published in 1947. It's the story of growing up on the prairies, of a child's search for God. It's an attempt to understand mortality, to come to terms with life and death. And in many ways, it's also the story of W.O. Mitchell.
A forever and forever sound it had. Forever and for never. Forever for the prairie, never for his father. Never again. People were forever born. People forever died. And never were again. Fathers died, and sons were born. The prairie was forever with its wind whispering through the long, dead grasses, through the long and endless silence. Winter came, and spring, and fall, then summer and winter again. The sun rose and set again, and everything that was once was again, forever and forever. But for man, the prairie whispered, never, never. And as the boy stood with the prairie stretching from him, he knew that things were different now, forever and forever. Forever the dark well of his mother's loneliness. Forever the silence that could never end. His mother. The thought of her filled him with tenderness and yearning. She needed him now. He could feel them sliding slowly down his cheek. He could taste the salt of them at the corners of his mouth. There were no catches of breath, simply tears as he stood alone in the silence that stretched from everlasting to everlasting. A meadowlark splintered the stillness.
His publishers were overjoyed when the critics raved over Who Has Seen the Wind. The New York Times said W.O. was brilliant and profound. Everyone was impressed with the reviews, but no one as much as Bill Mitchell's mother.
When these things come out, you know, the clipping services send you, and I don't know, I found out, they will get the same review that's printed clear across the continent in every different paper. And when Mother found out about this, she said, why don't you get, and I said, no, you get them all. She said, I'll join it. They joined it, and she was just up to her butt in clippings. So what she used to do, you know, she'd have 19 clippings, the same one printed in Halifax Chronicle. So she used to go out to tea or bridge. She'd have her purse all filled with clippings, and then Mrs. Hillier, Mrs. Getz, Mrs. Martin, or Mrs. Abercrombie, she would say, oh, I've got some of Bill's reviews. Would you like some? And she would give them clippings of the thing, yeah. Yeah. And as you can see, she kept, God, I didn't know there were so many of them. She kept a lot of them.
Who Has Seen the Wind established Mitchell as a professional writer and brought him to the attention of the editors of Maclean's magazine in Toronto. He became fiction editor and, among other things, started work on a series of short stories about a young boy growing up on a Saskatchewan farm. The stories would be turned into radio plays for the popular series Jake and the Kid.
I'm a pretty prolific guy. I mean, in dramatic writing, people don't realize I've written more dramatic writing in bulk, probably. Oh, that's a wrong sort of thing. But there were over 320 half-hour dramas in the Jake and the Kid thing alone.
Jake and the Kid.
Jake and the Kid was immensely popular, and Mitchell wrote all 320 episodes. But there were too many distractions in Toronto, and the Mitchells were soon back in the West, in the town of High River, Alberta. It was here that he started working on another novel, The Vanishing Point. An hour's drive from High River is the Stony Indian Reserve at Eden Valley. Mitchell taught school here for a year, and from that experience came a new novel. The Vanishing Point centers around a white schoolteacher working on an Indian reserve. Again, Mitchell tried to understand the rhythms of life and death, but there was something more this time. Here, there was a search, a desperate search, to discover why people were different and why they had so much trouble understanding each other.
Yet he was often visited by depression, reminded of the impossibility of ever knowing what happened in their minds and hearts. So, wasn't all communication between all humans hopeless? Out of my skin and into yours, I cannot get, however hard I try, however much I want to. All one could do was wish it were possible, and know that illusion was the best that could be managed. What a weak bridge emotion was for people to walk across to each other. Emotion swinging, unable to hold the heavy weight of communication. For once the passage was made, the door was always closed. You stopped at the eyes, and you had never left the home envelope of self anyway.
If I were an Indian in that book, came out, I wouldn't want that book to be done, because if I were read, I would want propaganda. You know, I wouldn't care to have what had. If I were just taking the idea that anything that's printed that shows us at all in a bad light, not a bad light, but the nature of the plight, you know, of alcoholism and destruction in ghettos in concrete jungle, I would just as soon not have people know about that.
The reviews for The Vanishing Point were not good. And although Canadian Indian reviewers praised it for its honesty, other critics accused Mitchell of racism. The accusations hurt.
There is nothing more lonely than a writer. Unlike a playwright, or a visual artist, the novelist never sees his faceless creative partner. Playwriting, you leave the typewriter, you're only half through. You go to the director, bounce it off him. You go then to the first read-through, the actors. You go then to tryouts, audience, and you know this is like playing darts in the dark. You don't know what are landing.
For many years, W.O. Mitchell has been landing at the Banff School of Fine Arts to take part in the writing classes. Every summer, young artists from across the country come here to study under professional painters, dancers, musicians, and writers. For Mitchell, teaching here is helping pay off an old debt.
I was helped when I was young. Professor Salter was a mentor of mine, and everybody, every writer, I don't care who he is, at some time there was someone who helped him. But I remember saying to Salter, you know, I don't know how I can ever thank you. And he said, you will, because he said, you're indebted to me now for helping you. And he told me to become a teacher. And he said, so you've got a debt to discharge to me, and you do it with other young writers long line. And I've always done that ever since.
Tell me, Anne, when you go in here, what sort of thing do you expect?
Well, I know for sure he'll cut right to the quick of it immediately.
You know, don't you?
Yeah.
It's awful. But why would you think it isn't working? These scenes in your... Why do you think...
When he's not teaching or writing or traveling or performing, W.O. Mitchell stays home. He's moved from High River and lives now in Calgary, in what the real estate people call a desirable district. He also spends a lot of time on his daughter's farm, playing with the grandchildren and struggling with mortality.
When I was a kid, I was going to live forever. All the time you're coasting downhill, from the time you're born, coasting along, and you don't even know every hill's got a bottom to her, till you're around 30, and then you start worrying because you know sometime you got to stop coasting, and there's only one ride. She nags at you, and she nags at you for the next 30, 40 years. But you get past 85, you couldn't care less. Get to 95, and you're immortal again. Just as immortal as you are right now, standing there, 10 years old.
Come on, we're making a kite. It's hard work, isn't it? But we didn't swear yet, did we? Does your dad swear when it doesn't go right? Huh? Does he?
W.O. Mitchell's novel, The Kite, was developed from an episode in the Jake and the Kid series. It's not a highly acclaimed novel, but for Mitchell, it's an important one.
The kite, strangely, broad as it may seem, with the oldest man in the world is a very dangerous novel for a writer to have written. You see, the surface is antic and broad, almost a caricature, but the under meaning of it is deadly, deadly serious.
In what way is it serious?
Well, the theme is you're mortal, and if you're mortal, you're going to die. And if you're going to die, never settle for less. No, that's the wrong way.
The Kite is the story of Daddy Sherry, the oldest man in the world. Again, Mitchell used the symbol of the wind as a way to truth and understanding. Holding on to the kite string became a way, symbolically, of holding on to life itself.
There's no wind for it.
If only his mind would soar, if it could lift with the effortless grace of a still-winged hawk riding a foothill's current to heights of ineffable detachment. Was that it? Their talk about leaping from cloud to cloud? Had their childlike reverie carelessly touched some profound truth, unaware? Whatever it was it of such faint and fragile substance that it would always elude him? God, it would be simply wonderful to have the hawk's high vision, if his understanding could tilt and hang against the rare sky, then with one superb slice fall upon the truth and hold it in sure beak and talon.
I want to be remembered as a loving-hearted and honorable human being. And I want to be remembered. You see, there's the thing. That's what I was getting at. Of course I don't believe in immortality. I don't mean, of course, that other people can't. It isn't right, but I don't. And to be remembered, I want it to be done, not me as an artist, but me as a total human being.